The crimson stain. The blood was still warm when it seeped into the cracks of the polished marble, staining the perfumed waters a crimson red. These waters, once meant to refresh the most powerful man in the world, now bore witness to his demise. In the deathly silence of the imperial palace, only the ragged gasps of breath broke the stillness that followed the final scream of Emperor Domitian, the 11th ruler of Rome. It was September 18, 96 AD, and the terror that had governed the empire for 15 long years had met its end at the hands of those who once trembled before his gaze. Domitian was not born to die like a lamb. The youngest son of Vespasian, founder of the Flavian dynasty, he grew up in the shadow of two older brothers, seemingly destined for greatness, while he remained relegated to the darker corners of family power. Titus, the eldest, shone as a conquering general, a hero of the Jewish war, beloved by the people and respected by the Senate. Domitian, in turn, was the silent boy who observed, calculated, and stored each humiliation like a burning coal in his chest. When Vespasian died in 79 AD, Titus assumed the imperial throne with the naturalness of someone who had always known it was his destiny. Domitian waited. When Titus died just 2 years later, a victim of a mysterious fever some whispered was poison, Domitian finally emerged from the shadows to claim what he considered his birthright. The 30-year-old emperor who ascended the throne in 81 AD was physically imposing, with broad shoulders and a bearing that commanded instant respect. His dark eyes possessed a piercing intensity that made men avert their gaze, and his voice, when raised in anger, echoed through the marble halls of the palace like the roar of a wounded beast. Unlike his predecessors, who sought to balance imperial power with the republican traditions of the Senate, Domitian had no patience for political games or diplomacy. He was Caesar, absolute lord of 60 million souls, and he wanted everyone to know it. The early years of his reign were marked by a brutal efficiency that restored discipline to the legions and brought prosperity to the provinces. Domitian was not merely a bloodthirsty tyrant. He was a competent administrator who understood the complex mechanisms of the empire like few before him. He built roads, erected monuments, reformed the judicial system, and ensured that grain regularly reached the tables of Roman citizens. His military campaigns in Germania and Dacia expanded the imperial frontiers and filled the public coffers with gold and slaves. For a time, it seemed that Rome had found in Domitian not just a ruler, but a true successor to the great Caesars of the past. However, something dark fermented in the depths of the imperial soul. Perhaps it was the natural paranoia of someone who had grown up observing palace conspiracies, or perhaps an insatiable thirst for recognition that had never been fully satisfied. Domitian began to demand that senators address him as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, a title that even the most megalomaniacal of his predecessors had not dared to officially claim. Those who hesitated to utter the sacred words quickly discovered that imperial clemency had very narrow limits. The imperial palace gradually transformed into a fortress of suspicion and terror. Domitian installed polished mirrors on the corridor walls to observe who approached from behind, a precaution that revealed the level of paranoia that was beginning to consume his mind. Praetorian guards patrolled day and night, and even the oldest servants were subjected to thorough searches before entering the imperial presence. The emperor developed the habit of constantly changing apartments, sleeping in different rooms each night, always accompanied by tasters who sampled his food and wine before he dared to touch them. Executions began sporadically, almost casually. A senator here, an officer there, always with accusations of treason that seemed plausible at first glance. Domitian had perfected the art of eliminating his enemies without appearing completely irrational. His victims always had some connection, however tenuous, to possible conspiracies or acts of disloyalty. But as the years passed, the criteria for treason became increasingly vague, and fear began to spread through patrician houses like an invisible plague. The Senate, once the proud guardian of republican traditions, bowed before the imperial will like wheat bent by the wind. Sessions that once teemed with passionate debates became exercises in ritual subservience, where senators competed to see who could demonstrate the greatest devotion to the dominus et deus. Words were weighed and measured with extreme care, for any misinterpreted phrase could result in charges of lèse-majesté. The thick air of the senatorial curia smelled of the cold sweat of fear, and the senator's eyes rarely met, as if each man feared that his thoughts could be read on the faces of his colleagues. Within the palace walls, the atmosphere became equally suffocating. Domitian had married Domitia Longina, a woman of extraordinary beauty and sharp intelligence, but even she was not immune to imperial suspicions. The emperor made a point of reminding his wife that divorce, or something worse, was always a possibility for those who disappointed his desires. Domitian learned to navigate the treacherous waters of the imperial mood with the dexterity of a dancer, whispering sweet words when necessary and remaining silent when prudence demanded it. But behind her beautiful eyes, observant onlookers could perceive the same fear that tormented all the other inhabitants of the palace. The Praetorian Guard, traditionally the emperor's most loyal protectors, began to murmur amongst themselves when they thought no one was listening. Clemens, the Praetorian prefect, was a middle-aged man whose loyalty had been tested in countless campaigns, but even his devotion had its limits. When Domitian ordered the execution of his own nephew, Flavius Clemens, on the nebulous charge of atheism, a euphemism for Christian sympathies, something irrevocably broke in the relationship between the emperor and those who had sworn to protect him with their lives. For those of you following these narratives on some of the darkest moments in human history, I invite you to subscribe to this channel where we continue exploring the mysteries and tragedies that shaped the destinies of empires and powerful men. Domitian's paranoia reached its peak in the late 80s when a revolt led by the governor of Upper Germania, Lucius Antonius Saturnius, nearly resulted in his deposition. Though the rebellion was quickly crushed by loyal legions, the episode convinced the emperor that enemies lurked in every shadow, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Executions multiplied exponentially. Entire families were wiped out on accusations of complicity with conspirators, and the city of Rome transformed into a graveyard of shattered ambitions and broken dreams. The final years of Domitian's reign were marked by a physical deterioration that mirrored his moral decay. The once imposing emperor began to show signs of premature aging. His graying temples turned completely white, and deep wrinkles furrowed his face like scars left by the ghosts of his victims. His eyes, once piercing and authoritarian, took on a feverish gleam that oscillated between terror and fury. The tremor in his hands, initially imperceptible, became so pronounced that he struggled to hold a wine goblet without spilling its contents. Sleep, that sacred refuge of mortals, completely deserted the emperor. Domitian wandered the palace corridors during the wee hours, followed by a Praetorian escort whose footsteps echoed like funeral drums in the deathly silence. Servants whispered that the emperor spoke to himself, holding entire conversations with imagined enemies or begging forgiveness from the ghosts of past executions. His diet became erratic. Days of complete fasting alternated with eating binges where he devoured entire dishes as if trying to fill a constantly growing inner void. Senate sessions became grotesque spectacles, where Domitian sometimes appeared in bizarre costumes. At times dressed as Jupiter Optimus Maximus, at others wearing the robes of other deities he claimed to embody. His voice, which once commanded respect through its natural authority, became shrill and hysterical, cracking during moments of extreme rage like that of a teenager undergoing a voice change. Senators reported in private letters that the emperor sometimes burst into uncontrollable laughter during serious debates, a sharp, piercing laugh that chilled the blood of everyone present. The situation became untenable when Domitian began to see treason in completely innocent gestures. A senator who coughed during an imperial speech was accused of disrespect and executed the following day. Another who arrived a few minutes late to a session was denounced as a potential conspirator and had his entire family banished to a rocky island in the Mediterranean. The very act of breathing in the imperial presence seemed to have become a potential crime, and the palace echoed with the constant sound of pleas and lamentations. It was in this atmosphere of absolute terror that the conspiracy formed which would finally seal the emperor's fate. Unlike previous attempts orchestrated by ambitious generals or disgruntled senators, this plot was born in the very heart of the palace, among those who intimately knew Domitian's weaknesses and routines. Clemens, the Praetorian prefect, could no longer ignore the fact that serving the emperor had become synonymous with participating in the systematic destruction of the empire he had sworn to protect. Domitia Longina, Domitia's own wife, came to the terrible conclusion that her survival depended on her husband's death. The conspiratorial group also included Stephanus, a freedman who managed Domitia's personal estates, and several other servants and guards who had lost friends and relatives in the imperial purges. The irony was bitter. The man who trusted slaves and freedmen more than free citizens would be betrayed precisely by those he considered most secure. For weeks, the conspirators communicated through furtive glances and coded gestures, each meeting a mortal risk that could result in the immediate execution of everyone involved. The plan was devised with the precision of a military operation. Stephanus would feign a wounded arm to justify the use of bandages that would conceal a dagger, and would take advantage of a moment when the emperor was relatively unguarded to deliver the initial blow. The other conspirators would be strategically positioned to eliminate any resistance and ensure the mission's completion. The date chosen was September 18th, a day that the court astrologers had identified as particularly auspicious for significant changes, a prophecy that would prove terrifyingly accurate. The night before the assassination, witnesses reported that Domitian had particularly intense nightmares. Terrified screams echoed from his private chambers, and guards stationed outside heard the emperor imploring unseen gods to protect him from approaching enemies. When he finally awoke, shortly before dawn, Domitian was drenched in cold sweat and trembling violently. He immediately summoned his astrologers and soothsayers, demanding that they interpret the signs he had perceived in his dreams. The entrails of the animals sacrificed that morning presented particularly gloomy omens. The priests, reluctant to be bearers of bad news, tried to downplay the significance of the dark-stained viscera and deformed livers, but Domitian was no fool. He could read the signs as well as any haruspics, and what he saw in the smoking organs confirmed his worst fears. Death was near, circling him like vultures waiting for the right moment to feast on a still warm carcass. It was at this moment that the other conspirators entered the chamber. Clemens arrived first, followed by 2 Praetorian guards who had been secretly co-opted into the conspiracy. The sight that greeted them was both tragic and grotesque. The most powerful man in the known world was agonizing on a blood-soaked throne, still struggling against a freedman physically far inferior to him. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on them. Decades of absolute power and imperial terror ended in a desperate struggle against a former slave. Clemens didn't hesitate. Drawing his own dagger, the Praetorian prefect approached the dying emperor and delivered the final blow. The blade pierced between the ribs, striking the heart directly and ending Domitian's suffering. The imperial body shuddered one last time, a sigh escaped his blood-stained lips, and then absolute quiet descended upon the chamber. Domitian, 11th Emperor of Rome, Lord and God to 60 million subjects, had died like any ordinary mortal,
betrayed and abandoned by the very men who once kissed his feet. The ensuing silence was broken only by the conspirators' ragged breathing and the steady drip of imperial blood flowing from the throne to form a growing pool on the marble floor. The scent of death began to permeate the chamber, overpowering the aromas of incense and roses, as if the very essence of mortality was claiming its dominion over the space that once housed divine pretensions. The conspirators knew they had only minutes before the emperor's absence was noticed. Working with silent efficiency, they removed any evidence that might link them to the murder, cleaned their weapons, and assumed positions that would provide them with convincing alibis.
Stephanus, most compromised by the imperial blood staining his clothes, was discreetly escorted out of the palace by a secondary route, disappearing into the Roman street crowds like a ghost returning to the realm of shadows. When the regular guards finally discovered Domitian's body, twilight had already fallen. The dead emperor had taken on the waxy pallor typical of corpses, and his eyes, which once terrorized senators and generals, were glazed over and fixed on the ornate ceiling of the chamber. The expression on his face was not one of peace or resignation, but of eternal surprise, as if even in death he couldn't believe that his self-proclaimed divinity had proven as fragile as the mortal flesh of any slave. The news of the imperial death spread through the palace like wildfire. Some servants reacted with ritualistic lamentations, others with barely concealed sighs of relief. In the Senate, when the news arrived, there was a moment of absolute silence followed by an explosion of joy that echoed through the streets of Rome. Senators who had spent years bowed in subservience suddenly shouted words of liberty and justice, like prisoners released after decades of captivity. But perhaps the most revealing reaction was that of the regular Praetorians, those not involved in the conspiracy. Many of them had served under Domitian since the beginning of his reign, and despite the terror he inspired, they felt a perverse form of loyalty to the dead emperor. For these soldiers, Domitian's death represented not only the end of an era, but also a betrayal of the sacred oaths they had sworn. Some even wept openly, not necessarily out of love for the emperor, but because of the perception that something fundamental had been irreparably broken in the heart of the empire. Domitian's body was prepared for funeral rites with a haste that revealed the general desire to bury not only the man, but also his memory. Embalmers worked throughout the night, using expensive ointments and spices imported from the East to preserve the imperial remains. But not even the most skillful cosmetics could completely erase the terrified expression of surprise that had fixed itself on the dead emperor's face, as if he were still processing the reality of his own mortality. The imperial cremation took place 3 days later, in a ceremony that mixed ritual grandeur with almost indecent haste. The Roman people attended en masse, not so much to pay homage to the dead emperor, but to confirm with their own eyes that the terror had truly ended. When the flames finally consumed Domitian's body, turning flesh and bone to ashes, many of those present felt as if a collective nightmare had finally come to an end. Nerva, a respected elder senator, was acclaimed as the new emperor just hours after Domitian's death, a succession so smooth that it confirmed how extensive the conspiracy against the dead tyrant had been. The new emperor immediately repealed the most oppressive laws of his predecessor and ordered the release of the political prisoners who still survived in the imperial dungeons. Rome breathed freely for the first time in 15 years. However, Domitian's death left deep scars on the soul of the empire that never fully healed. The paranoia and terror he had sown created dangerous precedents that would influence future generations of emperors. The notion that absolute power justified any atrocity and that suspicion was an imperial virtue became part of the Roman political DNA in a way that would shape the empire's destiny for centuries to come. In the final analysis, Domitian's terrible death serves as a somber reminder that even the most absolute power is ultimately an illusion built on the acquiescence of those who are governed. The emperor who proclaimed himself a god discovered in his agonizing final moments that divinity cannot be claimed by force, only granted by genuine veneration. His blood, spilled on the polished marble of his own palace,
revealed the fundamental fragility of all human pretensions to eternity and invulnerability. The echo of his final screams, stifled by the poison and steel of the conspirators, resonates through the centuries as a warning to the powerful that tyranny carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. Domitian had built his reign on fear, but discovered too late that fear, when taken to extremes, transforms loyal subjects into determined assassins. The irony of his death, betrayed not by external enemies, but by those who most benefited from his protection, remains one of history's most powerful examples of the dangers of paranoia and systematic cruelty. Today, almost 2,000 years later, when we visit the ruins of the imperial palace in Rome, we can still sense echoes of the tragedy that unfolded in those marble halls. The wind that blows through the broken stones carries whispers of ancient conspiracies and lamentations of long-forgotten victims. And perhaps, if we pay close enough attention to the silence of the ruins, we can still hear the last gasp of the emperor who wanted to be a god, but died a man, drowned not in water, but in his own blood and the bitterness of his own making.